This is my favourite Scottish fairy tale. It's a story set in the Borders about a girl called Janet. But it doesn't start with Janet. It starts with a boy called Tam Lin. Now, Tam Lin was the grandson of the Earl of Roxburgh, and he really wanted to go hunting with his grandfather and his grandfather's men in the forest. So he said, "Grandfather, am I old enough? Am I old enough now to come hunting with you?" And his grandfather said, "Yes, I think you are. But if you're going to come hunting with us in the forest, you must make two promises. You must not fall behind, and you must not fall off your pony." Now, Tam knew why he had to make those promises, and it wasn't because of the dangerous wild animals they were hunting in the forest. It was because of the fairies who lived in the forest. Now, these weren't wee, twinkly, glittery, winged fairies with magic wands and bags full of teeth. These fairies were as tall or taller than me. They had swords and spears and they had magic, but they used it sometimes to be mischievous or even cruel to the people who lived round the forest, and sometimes they stole our children. So Tam promised that he would not fall behind and that he would not fall off. But when he went hunting, his pony's legs were much, much shorter than the legs of the horses his father's men were riding, so he did fall behind. And neither he nor his pony were used to the rough ground under the trees in the forest, so his pony stumbled and he did fall off. But when he fell, he landed on a bright, green, grassy mound, and the bright green grassy mounds were often the entrance to the fairy world. So as soon as his back hit the grass, hands reached up and grabbed him and hauled him down and dragged him along underground corridors and threw him at the feet of the Faerie Queen. And Tam Lin struggled to stand up and looked at the Faerie Queen, and he could see that she was beautiful, but terrifyingly, terribly beautiful. And he looked her straight in the eyes, trying not to show his own fear. And the Faerie Queen looked back at him. And even as a young boy, Tam Lin was handsome, so the Faerie Queen liked what she saw. And so she cast a spell on Tam Lin, a spell that meant that as he grew into one of the fairy folk. And when he grew to his full height, he became one of the Faerie Queen's knights. Now, many years later, the young men and the young women of the area around Selkirk were told by their elders never to go into the woods at Carterhaugh. They were told never to go into Carterhaugh woods because those woods were guarded by the Faerie Queen's favourite, fiercest knight. But there was one girl who didn't like being told what to do, and she especially didn't like being told not to go into Carterhaugh woods, because she was Janet of Carterhaugh. Her father was the Laird of Carterhaugh, and she didn't see why she shouldn't be allowed to go into her own father's woods. So one summer, in the middle of summer, on a bright sunny day, Janet decided to visit Carterhaugh woods, and she took a step into the woods. She looked round. There were birds singing, there were flowers growing on the ground, the woods were beautiful, these woods were nothing to be afraid of. So she went deeper and further and deeper, right into the centre of the woods, and there she found a low stone well. And across the clearing from the well, she saw a white horse tied to a tree, and she thought, "Oh, wonder who that horse belongs to." So she sat down on the edge of the well and waited to see if anyone would come and claim the horse. And as she sat and waited and looked around, she noticed a bush beside her with white roses growing on it. And she thought one of those roses would look lovely on the collar of her dress, so she reached out. She grasped one of the roses and she twisted its stem, and as the stem broke, she heard a voice. "Who dares pick the Faerie Queen's flowers?" Janet looked round, and From the clearing on the other side, out of the trees, stepped a tall young man dressed all in green, and he shouted again, "Who dares pick the Faerie Queen's flowers?" Well, Janet stood up on the side of the well holding the flower, and she said, "I dare, and I am Janet of Carterhaugh. Who are you that you dare to speak to me like that in my own father's woods?" "I am Tam Lin," he said, "and I guard this wood for the Faerie Queen. Now give me back that flower." Janet looked at the white rose. She looked at Tam Lin, and slowly and carefully she pinned the rose to her collar. And Tam Lin was strong enough that he could have picked Janet up in one hand and thrown her out of the woods. But he didn't. He admired the way that she'd stood up to him and looked him straight in the eye, just as he tried to do years ago with the Faerie Queen. So instead of taking her in one hand and throwing her out the woods, he took Janet by the hand and he walked her round the woods, showing her the best places to pick flowers. And as they walked and as Janet gathered flowers, they talked. And Janet said, "So, have you always been one of the fairy folk?" "No," said Tam Lin, I was born as human as you." And he explained how he had fallen on the bright green mound and been dragged under the ground. And she said, "Oh, so do you enjoy being one of the fairy folk?" "Well," said Tam Lin, "it is. It's great and it's grand and it's glamorous and it's magical, but I don't have any choices. I must guard this wood for the Faerie Queen for as long as she wants me to." "Well, why don't you just break the spell?" said Janet. "Why don't you just change back to being human?" And Tam Lin laughed and said, "Well, it's not that easy. I couldn't break the Faerie Queen's spell without help." And Janet said, "Well, I would help you." "No," said Tam Lin, "it would take someone really, really brave to go up against the Faerie Queen." And Janet looked at the white rose she'd pinned to her collar and said, "I'm brave." "I know you're brave," said Tam Lin, "but I couldn't ask you to do that." "You're not asking," said Janet. "I'm offering." So that's why Tam Lin told her how to break the Faerie Queen's spell. He said, on Midsummer's Night, and that's tonight, the Faerie Queen's army will process around her lands, and at midnight they will be passing the well in Carterhaugh Wood. So if you're here at midnight, well hidden, you will see the army pass you. The first cohort will be led by a knight on a black horse. Do not let him see you. The second cohort will be led by a knight on a brown horse. Do not let him hear you. The third cohort will be led by a knight on a white horse. That will be me. And you'll know it's me because I will wear one glove and my other hand will be bare. And if you drag me down off my horse and wrap your arms round me and hold on tight, then you can break the Faerie Queen's spell. The Faerie Queen will turn me into all sorts of loathsome and dangerous creatures. If you can hold on tight until she turns me into a bright burning torch and then throw that torch into the well, then that will break the Faerie Queen's spell. And Janet promised that she would come back and she would hold on tight, and then she left Carterhaugh Woods, a bunch of the Faerie Queen's flowers in her arms. And late that night, Janet dressed in all her darkest clothes, a dark dress, black boots, a black cloak with the hood up, and she walked back into Carterhaugh Woods. She got to the edge of the woods and she took 3 steps in. She looked round. It was dark and shadowy. There were eyes winking in and out. In the shadows there were creaks and noises all around her. This was the wood she had been warned against. But she had made a promise. So she went further and deeper and further, right to the centre of the wood, to the well. But she didn't sit in the well. She crouched behind it. She hid under the white rose bush and she waited until midnight. And then she heard the thump of hooves and the jingle of harness, and the Faerie Queen's army processed past the well. And the first cohort was led by a knight on a black horse, and he crouched down low so that he couldn't see her. And the second cohort was led by a knight on a brown horse, and she held her breath so that he couldn't hear her. And the third cohort was led by a knight on a white horse with one bare hand. So Janet leapt up and grabbed that bare hand and dragged Tam Lin off the horse. And then she wrapped her arms round him and she held on tight. And she heard the Faerie Queen yell, "Let go of him! He's mine!" And Janet just said, "No." And she held on tight. And the Faerie Queen turned Tam Lin into a green snake, a great green scaly serpent. And Janet felt the serpent writhe round her arms and flick its tongue into her face, but she held on tight. And then the Faerie Queen turned Tam Lin into a lion. And Janet felt the lion's claws scrape her shoulder and smelt its raw, meaty breath on her face, but she held on tight. And the Faerie Queen turned Tam Lin into a huge brown bear. And Janet felt its great weight crush her ribs and its heavy fur smother her, but she held on tight. And the Faerie Queen turned Tam Lin into a molten bar of iron. And Janet felt the heat on her arms and smelt her dress burn and singe, but she held on tight. And then the Faerie Queen turned Tam Lin into a burning torch, a flaming branch. And Janet took the branch and she threw it into the well. And the water bubbled and the water hissed and a great cloud of steam rose out of the well. And Tam Lin stepped out, dripping wet, but smiling. And he took Janet by the hand and they walked out of Carterhaugh woods, free forever from the Faerie Queen's power. And because this is a fairy tale, Tam Lin and Janet got married and lived happily ever after. And you can go to Carterhaugh woods now. The well is still there, there are still a few trees. You can tell the story of Janet and Tam Lin under the trees beside the well. But while you're there, don't pick any flowers, because I don't know who guards those woods for the Faerie Queen now.